The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace, as Sergeant William Thompson adjusted his red tunic one final time. The brass buttons gleamed like mirrors, each one polished to perfection the night before. His bearskin hat sat perfectly straight, adding nearly a foot to his already imposing 6-foot frame. Today marked his 15th year serving as one of the Queen's Guards, and the pride he felt never grew old. Thompson had earned his position through years of dedicated service in the British Army. He had served in Afghanistan, where he learned the true meaning of duty and honor. Those experiences shaped him into the disciplined soldier who now stood guard at one of the most famous palaces in the world. Every tourist who passed by saw the stoic figure in red, but few understood the rigorous training and unwavering commitment required to wear that uniform. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock, and tourists were already gathering behind the iron gates. Thompson could hear the excited chatter of visitors from around the world, their cameras ready to capture the iconic British tradition. Children pressed their faces against the metal bars, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous guards who never moved or spoke while on duty. As Thompson took his position at the palace entrance, he noticed something unusual in the crowd. A man in an elaborate military uniform was pushing through the gathering tourists with an air of importance that seemed out of place. The uniform was unfamiliar, not British certainly, with gold braiding and medals that caught the sunlight. The man wore the bearing of someone accustomed to command, his chin raised and shoulders back in a display of military bearing. The stranger's uniform suggested high rank, possibly that of a general from a foreign military. Thompson had encountered many foreign dignitaries during his years of service, and he recognized the confident stride of someone used to being saluted and obeyed. However, something about this particular visitor struck Thompson as different. There was an arrogance in the man's demeanor that went beyond simple military confidence. Thompson remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. The Queen's Guards were famous for their ability to remain motionless for hours, regardless of weather, distractions, or attempts by tourists to make them react. This discipline was not just tradition. It was a matter of professional pride and respect for the crown they served. The foreign general continued to approach, and Thompson could sense the man's expectation that something should happen. Other tourists began to notice the elaborately dressed figure, some stepping aside to allow him passage. Whispers began to spread through the crowd as people wondered if this was part of some special ceremony they were about to witness. Thompson's training had prepared him for many situations, but he could feel that something unusual was about to unfold. The protocols were clear about how to handle various scenarios, from medical emergencies to security threats. However, the approaching general seemed to present a different kind of challenge, one that would test not just Thompson's discipline, but his understanding of military protocol and respect for his own nation's traditions. As the general drew closer, Thompson maintained his rigid posture, his rifle held at precisely the correct angle, his gaze unwavering. The crowd's excitement grew as they sensed they were about to witness something memorable. Little did they know that this encounter would become a lesson in respect, protocol, and the consequences of assumptions. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be talked about for years to come. A moment when tradition would meet arrogance, and only one would emerge with dignity and tact. General Viktor Petrov adjusted his gold-braided uniform as he strode confidently toward the palace entrance. The medals on his chest told the story of a distinguished military career in his home country of Moldavia, a small nation where his family name carried significant weight. Petrov had grown accustomed to immediate recognition and respect wherever he traveled, especially when wearing his full-dress uniform. The general had arrived in London 3 days earlier as part of a diplomatic mission. Though the official meetings had concluded yesterday, today was meant to be a leisurely tour of London's famous landmarks before his evening flight home. Buckingham Palace was at the top of his list, not just for its historical significance, but because he wanted to see the famous guards he had heard so much about. In Petrov's mind, this visit represented more than simple tourism. He saw it as an opportunity to pay his respects from one military professional to another. Throughout his career, he had always believed that soldiers should acknowledge each other's service, regardless of nationality. The gold stars on his shoulders marked him as a 3-star general, equivalent to a lieutenant general in the British system, and he expected that rank to be recognized and respected. As he approached the guard station, Petrov noticed how perfectly still the British soldier stood. The red uniform was indeed impressive, and the discipline required to maintain such stillness was something he could appreciate as a military man. However, he also felt that such rigid formality seemed somewhat outdated in the modern world. In his own military, protocols existed but were often adapted to show mutual respect between allied forces. Petrov had researched British military traditions before his visit and knew that the Queen's guards were selected from active infantry regiments. These were not merely ceremonial soldiers but combat veterans who had earned their positions through merit and service. This knowledge only reinforced his belief that a proper military greeting between professionals was not just appropriate, but necessary. The general slowed his pace as he drew within 20 feet of the guard. Several tourists noticed his approach and began to gather, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Some raised their cameras, thinking they might capture a special moment or ceremony. The anticipation in the crowd was palpable as people wondered what would transpire between the two military figures. Petrov straightened his shoulders and prepared to render what he considered a proper military salute. In his mind, this gesture would demonstrate respect for the guard service while also acknowledging his own status as a visiting military officer. He had performed similar courtesies in other countries and had always found them to be well received by local military personnel. What the general failed to understand was the fundamental difference between his expectations and British military protocol. The Queen's Guards operate under strict rules of engagement that have been refined over centuries of tradition. Their primary duty is to protect the sovereign and maintain the dignity of their post, not to engage in casual military courtesies with foreign visitors, regardless of rank or intent. As Petrov continued his approach, Thompson remained perfectly motionless, his training keeping him focused on his duties rather than the approaching figure. The sergeant's experience had taught him to be aware of everything happening around him, while never breaking character. He could sense the crowd's growing excitement and the approaching general's confident demeanor, but his obligations were clear and unchanging. The stage was now set for a collision between two very different military cultures and their understanding of appropriate protocol. Petrov's well-intentioned gesture was about to meet centuries of British tradition, and the result would serve as a powerful reminder that respect for local customs and protocols should always take precedence over personal expectations, regardless of one's rank or position. The moment arrived with the precision of a carefully choreographed dance. General Petrov came to a halt directly in front of Sergeant Thompson, close enough that the gold braiding on his uniform was clearly visible. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, forming a semicircle around the two military figures. Camera phones were raised and conversations hushed as everyone sensed they were about to witness something significant. Petrov drew himself to his full height and brought his right hand up in a crisp military salute. His movements were sharp and professional, executed with the precision that comes from decades of military training. The gesture was meant to convey respect from one professional soldier to another, a bridge between different nations and military traditions. In his mind, this was simply proper military courtesy. The general held his salute for several seconds, expecting some form of acknowledgement from the British Guard. His eyes remained fixed on Thompson's face, waiting for any sign of recognition or response. The tourists around them held their breath, anticipating a moment of international military fellowship that would make for perfect photographs and memorable stories to share back home. But Thompson remained absolutely motionless. His gaze stayed fixed straight ahead, looking neither at the general nor acknowledging his presence in any way. The sergeant's rifle remained at precisely the same angle, his posture unchanged, his expression as stoic as the palace stones behind him. To the untrained observer, it might have seemed as though he had not even noticed the general's presence. The seconds stretched longer, and Petrov's confidence began to waver slightly. He had expected immediate recognition of his gesture, perhaps even a return salute or at least some acknowledgement of his rank and courtesy. Instead, he found himself facing what appeared to be complete indifference. The general's arm began to feel heavy as he maintained his salute, waiting for a response that was clearly not coming. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd of onlookers. Some tourists assumed this was part of the ceremony and continued taking photos, while others began to sense that something was not proceeding as the general had anticipated. A few visitors whispered questions about whether the guard was supposed to respond, creating a buzz of uncertainty that spread through the gathering. After what felt like an eternity but was actually only about 30 seconds, Petrov slowly lowered his arm. Confusion and embarrassment began to color his features as he realized his gesture had been completely ignored. The general stood there for another moment, uncertain how to proceed. His military training had not prepared him for this particular scenario, being completely disregarded while attempting to show respect. Thompson, meanwhile, continued to demonstrate the discipline that had made the Queen's Guards legendary. His awareness of the situation was complete, but his training demanded that he maintain his post without deviation. The sergeant understood that his duty was not to engage with visitors, regardless of their rank, nationality, or intentions. The protocols were clear and had been established for very good reasons. The general's face began to show signs of irritation. What he had intended as a gesture of mutual respect had been met with what appeared to be deliberate disrespect. In his military culture, ignoring a superior officer's salute was a serious breach of protocol that could result in disciplinary action. He began to interpret Thompson's stillness not as professional duty, but as a personal slight against his authority and standing. The crowd continued to watch, now with growing tension rather than anticipation. What had promised to be a moment of ceremonial beauty was becoming something else entirely. A cultural misunderstanding that was about to escalate into something much more serious. Neither man was wrong within the context of his own military tradition, but their collision was creating a situation that would soon demand resolution. General Petrov's frustration transformed into anger as he stood before the motionless guard. The embarrassment of being ignored in front of dozens of tourists was not something his pride could easily accept. In his home country, such behavior toward a general would be unthinkable and would result in immediate consequences for the subordinate officer. The cultural gap between his expectations and British protocol was widening into a dangerous chasm. The general took a step closer to Thompson, his voice rising enough for the surrounding crowd to hear clearly. "Soldier, I am General Viktor Petrov of the Moldavian Armed Forces. I rendered you a proper military salute, and protocol demands that you acknowledge it. Your behavior is disrespectful to both your uniform and mine." The tourists around them began to shift uncomfortably. What had started as an exciting photo opportunity was now becoming an uncomfortable confrontation. Some visitors lowered their cameras, unsure whether they should continue recording what was clearly becoming a tense situation. Others backed away slightly, sensing that the atmosphere had changed from ceremonial to confrontational. Thompson's training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. He had encountered aggressive visitors before, people who tried to provoke reactions through insults, physical contact, or attempts to command his attention. The sergeant's response was always the same: complete adherence to protocol regardless of the circumstances. His job was to guard the palace, not to engage in discussions about military courtesy with foreign visitors. Petrov's voice grew louder and more demanding. "I am speaking to you, soldier. In any civilized military, ignoring a superior officer is grounds for court-martial. I demand that you show proper respect for rank and render appropriate honors." The general's face was now flushed with anger, and his hands were clenched at his sides. The humiliation of being ignored was compounding with each passing second. A palace security officer had been monitoring the situation from a discreet distance. Sergeant James Mitchell, a veteran of the Royal Military Police, recognized that the confrontation was escalating beyond what the Queen's Guard should have to handle alone. Mitchell began walking slowly toward the scene, his trained eye assessing the general's body language and the growing crowd's reaction. The onlookers were now clearly divided between those who felt sympathy for the general's apparent embarrassment and those who admired the guard's unwavering discipline. Some tourists began discussing the situation in hushed tones, with a few expressing the opinion that the guard was being unnecessarily rude. Others argued that traditions should be respected and that the foreign officer should understand local customs. Thompson could hear every word being spoken, but his focus remained on his primary duty. Years of training had ingrained in him the understanding that the Queen's Guard serve a purpose beyond mere ceremony. They are active soldiers responsible for the security of the monarch and the palace. Engaging with confrontational visitors, regardless of their military rank, could compromise that mission and set dangerous precedents. The general made another attempt to provoke a response, this time questioning Thompson's competence as a soldier. Perhaps you cannot hear me through that ridiculous hat, or maybe the British Army no longer teaches basic military courtesy. In my country, soldiers are trained to respect their betters and understand proper protocol. The insult to his professional competence and his nation's military standards struck deep, but Thompson's discipline held firm. Inside his mind, the sergeant was calculating distances, assessing potential threats and monitoring the security officer's approach. His stillness was not passive but actively professional, demonstrating the very military excellence that Petrov was questioning. As the confrontation continued to build, it became clear that this situation would require intervention. The clash between two military cultures was about to reach a breaking point, and the resolution would serve as a lesson about the importance of understanding and respecting local customs, regardless of one's personal rank or expectations. Sergeant Mitchell approached the confrontation with the calm authority that comes from years of handling delicate security situations. His uniform bore the distinctive markings of the Royal Military Police, and his approach was both measured and purposeful. The experienced security officer had witnessed similar cultural misunderstandings before, though few had escalated to this level of public confrontation. "Excuse me, General," Mitchell said in a clear, professional voice that carried just enough authority to command attention without being threatening. "I am Sergeant Mitchell, Royal Military Police. I understand there may be some confusion about our protocols here at the palace. Perhaps I can assist in clarifying the situation." General Petrov turned toward the approaching officer, his anger still evident, but now mixed with relief that someone was finally acknowledging his presence and rank. "Sergeant, I am General Viktor Petrov, and I have been attempting to show proper military courtesy to your guard. His refusal to acknowledge my salute is highly inappropriate and reflects poorly on British military standards." Mitchell nodded respectfully, recognizing the general's obvious frustration while also understanding exactly why Thompson had maintained his position. "General Petrov, I appreciate your desire to show military courtesy, and I can see that your intentions are honorable. However, I need to explain our specific protocols regarding the Queen's Guards and their duties while on post." The crowd around them had grown even larger, with tourists straining to hear the conversation. Many visitors were learning for the first time about the serious military nature of what they had previously considered merely a colorful tradition. The presence of the military police officer had elevated the situation from entertainment to education. "The Queen's Guards," Mitchell continued, "operate under very specific orders that have been refined over centuries of service. When on duty at their posts, they are not permitted to engage with visitors in any manner, regardless of rank, nationality, or intent. This is not a matter of disrespect, but rather a fundamental requirement of their security mission." General Petrov's expression began to show the first signs of understanding, though his pride was still wounded by the public nature of his misunderstanding. "Are you telling me that your guards are forbidden from acknowledging military courtesies, even from allied foreign officers?" "That is correct, sir," Mitchell replied. "The guard's primary responsibility is the protection of Her Majesty and this palace. Any deviation from their prescribed duties, including social interactions or military courtesies, could potentially compromise their mission. It is a matter of operational security, not personal disrespect." Thompson continued to maintain his position throughout the conversation, his discipline never wavering, despite the discussion taking place directly in front of him. The sergeant's professional demeanor served as a living example of the very standards that Mitchell was explaining to the general. His stillness was not stubbornness but dedication to duty at the highest level. The military police sergeant's explanation began to have its intended effect. General Petrov's anger was slowly being replaced by a growing understanding of the cultural and operational differences between British and Moldavian military protocols. However, the public nature of his mistake made acceptance difficult for an officer accustomed to unquestioned authority. "I see," Petrov said slowly, his voice carrying a mixture of comprehension and residual frustration. "In my military, such rigid protocols would be considered inflexible and potentially counterproductive to international relations. However, I am beginning to understand that your traditions operate under different principles. Mitchell recognized that the general was struggling to maintain his dignity while accepting the explanation. The sergeant's next words would be crucial in either resolving the situation diplomatically or allowing it to escalate further. The watching crowd, the unwavering guard, and the embarrassed general all waited for the response that would determine how this cultural collision would ultimately be resolved. Sergeant Mitchell chose his next words carefully, understanding that the resolution of this situation would determine whether General Petrov left with dignity or continued frustration. General, your military record and rank deserve respect, and I want to ensure you understand that our guard's behavior reflects the highest standards of British military discipline. Not any disregard for your service or position. The military police officer gestured toward Thompson, who remained perfectly still throughout the discussion. Sergeant Thompson has served multiple tours in Afghanistan and has earned his position through demonstrated courage and competence. His ability to maintain his post regardless of distractions is exactly why he was selected for this honor. It is a mark of his professionalism, not a lack of courtesy. General Petrov studied Thompson's face for the first time, really looking at the man behind the ceremony. The sergeant's weathered features spoke of experience and hardship that went far beyond parade ground duties. The general began to recognize something familiar in Thompson's bearing, the quiet confidence that comes from proven combat service. I see, Petrov said, his tone softening slightly. So these guards are not merely ceremonial soldiers but active combat veterans? The general's military mind was beginning to process the situation from a different perspective, one that emphasized operational necessity over social courtesy. Exactly, sir, Mitchell confirmed. The Queen's Guards are drawn from active infantry regiments. They are serving soldiers first, ceremonial figures second. Their protocols exist to ensure they can fulfill their primary mission of protection while maintaining the traditions that tourists from around the world come to see. The crowd around them had become educational audience to this cross-cultural military lesson. Many tourists were hearing for the first time about the serious nature of the colorful ceremony they had come to witness. The romantic notion of purely ceremonial guards was being replaced by a more complex understanding of tradition, combined with active military duty. General Petrov took a step back from Thompson, his posture shifting from confrontational to contemplative. The explanation was making sense from a tactical perspective, even if it differed from his own military culture's approach to international courtesy. In my experience, flexibility in protocol often serves diplomatic purposes better than rigid adherence to rules. That may be true in many circumstances, General, Mitchell replied diplomatically. However, the Queen's Guards operate in a unique environment where thousands of visitors from dozens of countries interact with our personnel daily. Consistent protocols protect both our soldiers and our visitors from misunderstandings and potential security risks. The general nodded slowly, beginning to appreciate the complexity of managing both security and public relations in such a high-profile setting. His own military experience had been primarily in more controlled environments where exceptions to protocol could be made based on circumstances and relationships. I must admit, Petrov said, looking around at the crowd of interested onlookers, that your explanation helps me understand the situation better. However, the public nature of this misunderstanding has been somewhat embarrassing for an officer of my rank and experience. Mitchell recognized the general's need to save face while accepting the explanation. The sergeant's response would need to acknowledge Petrov's dignity while reinforcing the correctness of British protocols. General, your attempt to show military courtesy demonstrates the respect for tradition that any professional soldier would appreciate. The misunderstanding arose from different military cultures, not from any failure on your part. As the conversation continued, Thompson remained at his post, a living symbol of the very principles being discussed. His unwavering discipline throughout the confrontation served as proof of the military excellence that the protocols were designed to protect and maintain. The guard's performance under pressure was exactly what his training had prepared him to deliver. The resolution came with a grace that surprised everyone present, including General Petrov himself. After listening to Sergeant Mitchell's patient explanation, the general's military mind began to appreciate the tactical wisdom behind the British protocols. His anger had transformed into grudging respect for a system that prioritized mission accomplishment over social niceties. "Sergeant Mitchell," the general said, straightening his uniform, "I want to thank you for taking the time to explain your procedures. As a professional soldier, I can appreciate the importance of maintaining operational discipline, even when it conflicts with personal preferences or cultural expectations." The military police officer nodded respectfully. "General, your understanding demonstrates the professionalism that marks true military leaders. Different armies develop different solutions to similar challenges, but we all share the common goal of protecting our nations and maintaining military excellence." General Petrov turned to look one final time at Sergeant Thompson, who continued to maintain his perfect stillness despite the lengthy discussion that had taken place directly in front of him. The general's expression had changed completely from its earlier anger to something approaching admiration for the British soldiers' unwavering discipline. "Sergeant Thompson," the general said, knowing full well that the guard would not respond, "your dedication to duty is evident, and I respect your commitment to your mission. I misjudged the situation, and I apologize for my initial reaction." The crowd of tourists who had witnessed the entire exchange began to applaud spontaneously. What had started as a confrontation had transformed into an unexpected lesson about military professionalism, cultural understanding, and the importance of maintaining standards regardless of pressure or circumstances. Sergeant Mitchell smiled slightly at the positive resolution. "General, if you would like, I would be happy to arrange a brief meeting with our commanding officer later today. He could provide you with more detailed information about our procedures and perhaps discuss some of the similarities and differences between our military traditions." General Petrov considered the offer for a moment before nodding appreciatively. "I would welcome that opportunity, Sergeant. This experience has taught me that there is always more to learn about how different military organizations approach their responsibilities." As the crowd began to disperse, many tourists commented on how much they had learned from witnessing the exchange. What they had expected to be a simple photo opportunity had become an education about military discipline, cultural sensitivity, and the professional resolution of misunderstandings. General Petrov took one last look at the palace and its unwavering guardian before turning to leave. His mistake had cost him some initial embarrassment, but the experience had ultimately provided him with valuable insights into British military culture and his own assumptions about international protocol. Sergeant Thompson remained at his post as the general walked away, his discipline unbroken and his mission unchanged. The Guards' performance throughout the incident had exemplified everything the Queen's Guards represented: unwavering dedication, professional excellence, and the ability to maintain standards regardless of external pressures. As the morning continued, the changing of the guard ceremony proceeded exactly as scheduled. Thompson was eventually relieved by his replacement, who took up the post with the same dedication and discipline. The incident with General Petrov became another story in the long history of the Queen's Guards, a reminder that true military professionalism sometimes requires the courage to maintain standards even when they are misunderstood or challenged. The general's lesson was complete. His mistake had indeed cost him instantly, not in terms of punishment or consequence, but in the immediate loss of his certainty about how military courtesy should be universally applied. The experience taught him that respect for local customs and protocols should always take precedence over personal expectations, regardless of rank or position. It was a lesson that would serve him well in future international encounters and make him a more effective military diplomat.